There's a detail in the story of Noah that most people read right past and never stopped to consider. Not the ark, not the flood, not the rainbow. It's a single sentence in Genesis chapter 7 verse 16. After Noah and his family stepped on board, the Lord shut the door behind them, not Noah, God himself, from the outside, and then the rain began. 40 days. Noah did nothing during that time. He couldn't do anything. He sat in the darkness, listening to water pound against the hull hour after hour. Unable to see what was happening outside, not knowing when it would end, not in control of anything, just waiting, just trusting. That is the first time the number 40 appears in the Bible, and it doesn't begin with action, not with courage or strategy or strength. It begins with a door locked from the outside, and a man learning to hold on when he couldn't see anything at all. That number would appear again, many times, across stories completely unlike each other, separated by hundreds of years, written by people who never met. A prophet so exhausted he begged to die, then got up and walked for 40 days without stopping. A powerful army frozen in place for 40 days, too afraid to step forward. A Savior who went 40 days without food in the wilderness and never broke. An ancient law that carved the number 40 into stone, not as punishment, but as the boundary of mercy. Same number. Stories that couldn't be more different. Most people, when they think of 40 in the Bible, land on the same familiar conclusion. This is the number of testing, of punishment, of hardship. And yes, sometimes it carries that weight. But if that's the only way you read it, you're missing something far more important. Because when you look at the Hebrew letter behind this number, when you see the image that ancient Jewish writers used to write it, the way you read all of these stories will change. Not because this is some hidden code that needs to be cracked, but because this is what the biblical text itself has been saying to you, over and over for thousands of years, and we keep reading straight past it. I've been studying these appearances for years, and the one that stopped me the longest wasn't Noah, wasn't Moses, wasn't Jesus. It was an army that stood completely still for 40 days straight, every morning, every evening, day after day, and not one single person stepped out. We'll get there. But first, let's start where this number starts, with a single letter and an image of water. In Hebrew, numbers are not arbitrary symbols. Every number corresponds to a letter, and every letter carries its own image, not a metaphor, not a mystical symbol, but a concrete picture that ancient Jewish writers used to write and see every single day. The number 40 corresponds to the 13th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Mem, and the original pictographic form of Mem, long before it took on the square shape it has today, was an image of waves. Water. Not a coincidence. The Hebrew word for water is mayim. It begins with Mem and ends with Mem. Water wraps around the word from both sides. And the connection between the number 40 and water runs through the entire Bible like an underground current, one that, once you see it, you can't unsee. The flood lasted 40 days. The Israelites crossed the Red Sea and then wandered 40 years in the wilderness. Moses, whose name in Egyptian means drawn up from the water, spent 40 days on Mount Sinai. Jesus was baptized in water and immediately led into the wilderness for 40 days. Water in Scripture does two things at the same time. It destroys and it gives life. It drowned Pharaoh's army and split open for Israel to walk through on dry ground. It judged the earth and then receded to reveal a world washed clean. And the letter Mem, with its numerical value of 40, consistently appears at the intersection of those two realities. Not on the side of destruction, not on the side of renewal, but right at the boundary between them. This is what the text keeps doing, not once but dozens of times, and no one needs to decode anything to see it. But there's one detail about Mem I want you to keep in mind for the rest of this video. The letter Mem exists in two forms. The open Mem, used at the beginning and middle of a word, has a gap in its shape, like water still flowing, like a way out that still exists. The closed Mem, called Mem Sofit, used at the end of a word, is completely sealed. No gap, no opening, like a vessel with no way out from any side. Two forms, the same letter, the same number. When you're in a season where you can still see a way through, that's the open Mem. When you're in a season where every direction feels sealed off, nothing is moving, nothing is opening, that's Mem Sofit. But ancient Jewish writers did not treat these as two different letters. They are the same letter, the same God present in both. The number 40 carries the weight of both forms, and in the stories we're about to walk through, you'll see exactly that. Let's go back to that door. Genesis 7:16, the Lord shut him in. One short sentence. Most people read past it in half a second and move on to the next verse. But if you stop here, if you actually think about what this is saying, it completely changes how you read the 40 days that follow. Noah didn't shut the door. Not because he forgot, not because he wasn't strong enough, but because it wasn't his to shut. God closed it from the outside, and from that moment, Noah was no longer in control of anything. He didn't get to decide when the rain would start. He couldn't see how high the water was rising. He had no idea what was happening outside. He could only listen. The sound of rain, the sound of water, the sound of wood groaning as the ark began to lift. 40 days like that. Try to picture it once, not as a familiar Bible story, but as the real experience of a real human being. Darkness, constant noise from outside. Nothing to do but trust that the door was closed by the right hands. But here's the detail almost no one notices. When the rain stopped, Noah still didn't open the door. He kept waiting. The water remained on the earth for 150 days. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The tops of the mountains began to appear. And then, Genesis 8:6, Noah waited another 40 days before he opened the window. Same number. A second time. The first 40. Going into the darkness, door locked, unable to see anything. The second 40. Standing at the threshold of a new world, watching the mountaintops emerge, and still waiting. Still not pushing his way out. Still letting God decide the moment. And when Noah finally stepped out, Genesis 9:11, God established a covenant. The rainbow appeared. A new chapter opened. Both thresholds, going into the darkness and stepping out into the light, were marked by 40. The number isn't attached to the suffering alone. It's attached to the entire journey. From the moment the door closed to the moment God said, "All right, now come out." What the first 40 days in the Bible teaches is not simply to endure with patience. It teaches something deeper and far more difficult. Trust the hands that shut the door, because those same hands know exactly when to open it again. Noah didn't get to choose the 40 days of rain. He didn't get to choose the 40 days of waiting that followed. But he chose one thing: he didn't force the door open ahead of time. And that is why when he finally set foot on the ground, it was the ground of an entirely new world. Noah walked out of his 40 days with a covenant. But not every 40 in the Bible starts at the lowest point and moves upward. Sometimes it starts at the top and leads you somewhere you never expected to need. There's a question Moses asked in Exodus chapter 33 that I keep coming back to after years of studying this passage. Not a question about the law, not a question about the people, not a question about what comes next. He asked, "Show me your glory." To understand why that matters, you need to know the circumstances in which it was spoken. Moses had just come down the mountain after the first 40 days on Sinai. He was carrying 2 stone tablets, the covenant of God, and he came down to find the Israelites dancing around a golden calf they had made with their own hands. He smashed the tablets at the foot of the mountain. Then he had to stand in the middle of the aftermath of one of the greatest acts of betrayal in Israel's history. And after all of that, after the disappointment, after the judgment, after the heaviest days of his entire ministry, what Moses asked for was not strength to keep going, not a solution for his stubborn people. He asked to see God. That is the prayer of a man who has nothing left to lean on. And God answered, not with an explanation, but with presence. He placed Moses in the cleft of a rock, covered him with his hand, and let his glory pass by. Then he said, "Cut 2 new tablets of stone and come back up the mountain." That is how the second 40 days began. Not with fresh enthusiasm, not with the clean slate of someone who had never failed, but with a man who had seen everything that could go wrong and climbed back up anyway. What happened during those 40 days was completely different from the first time. The first time, Moses received the law, the commandments, the ordinances, the detailed blueprints for the tabernacle. This time, Exodus 34:6-7 records what God proclaimed about himself as he passed before Moses. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. The first time Moses received the law. The second time he received something deeper than the law. He received the character of the one who gave it. And when Moses came down the mountain this time, Exodus 34:29, his face was radiant, not because he had completed a mission, but because he had been in the presence of God long enough for that light to absorb into him, without him even realizing it. After years of reading this passage, what I can't move past is not the light on Moses' face. It's the fact that the second 40 days only happened because he was willing to go back after failure. He didn't wait until everything had settled. He didn't wait until he felt worthy. He cut 2 new tablets of stone and climbed the mountain. The second 40 wasn't for someone who had never stumbled. It was for someone who knew what they needed more than anything else, and had the courage to go back and ask for it. Moses went back up the mountain alone. But the next story about the number 40 is not about one person stepping bravely into their own journey. It's about thousands of people, a fully equipped army, and every single one of them standing still. 1 Samuel 17:16, Goliath came forward every morning and every evening, 40 days in a row. This is the detail most readers skim past to get straight to the part where David picks up his stones. But stop here for a moment, because those 40 days are not the backdrop of the story. They are the story. Picture the scene. Every morning, Goliath steps out, over 8 feet tall, bronze armor from head to foot, his voice thundering across the valley of Elah. And every morning, the army of Israel looks at him and no one steps forward. Every evening, the same thing. Day 1, day 10, day 20, day 40, 480 challenges, and not one person. This is the only time in the Bible where the number 40 is not attached to the journey of an individual being led by God. No one in the army of Israel was led into those 40 days. No angel came, no word from God, just fear growing day after day completely unchallenged. And what those 40 days exposed was not Goliath's strength. It was what the entire army of Israel was actually trusting in. They looked at the armor. They looked at the height. They looked at the weapons. And they concluded there was no way to win. Their faith was placed in what their eyes could see, and what their eyes could see wasn't enough. So they stood still. Then a boy showed up. Not a soldier, no armor, no military training. David had come only to bring food to his brothers, and he heard Goliath for the first time. His response wasn't to calculate his odds. His first question was, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? 1 Samuel 17:26. He didn't look at Goliath and see an opponent. He looked at Goliath and saw someone insulting God. That was the only difference between David and the entire army that had been standing still for 40 days. Not courage, not skill, but what he placed his trust in. Those 40 days didn't transform anyone in the army of Israel. They came out of those 40 days exactly the same as when they went in, and that is precisely what the number 40 sometimes does. Not produce transformation, but expose what you are actually standing on. Fire tests gold, and 40 days tests where your faith is placed. But if the story of Goliath shows what 40 does to an army, the next story shows what 40 does to an entire nation, over and over again, across generations. And this is the part that almost no one slows down to read carefully. The book of Judges is one of the least carefully read books in the Bible. Most people know a few names, Gideon, Samson, Deborah, but very few stop to look at the structure underneath those stories. And when you do, you see the number 40 doing something that none of the previous stories showed. The cycle in Judges repeats itself in the same rhythm every time. Israel turns away from God. God allows them to fall into the hands of their enemies. They cry out. God raises up a judge to deliver them. The enemy is defeated. And then, the land has rest for 40 years. Othniel delivers Israel. The land has rest for 40 years. Judges 3:11. Deborah and Barak defeat Canaan. The land has rest for 40 years. Judges 5:1. Gideon defeats the Midianites. The land has rest for 40 years. Judges 8:28. 3 times. Same number. Same result. But here's what's worth paying attention to. In every previous appearance of 40, it was a corridor of testing, of waiting, of being formed, Noah waiting in the darkness, Moses climbing the mountain alone, the army of Israel trembling through each day. But here, 40 years is not a test, it's a gift. Every time God delivers his people, he doesn't just defeat the enemy and walk away. He gives them exactly 40 years to rest, to rebuild, to remember, to teach the next generation who he is. 40 years is enough time for a child to be born, grow up, become an adult, and have children of their own. Enough for an entire generation to be shaped in peace rather than in war. Enough for the memory of God's deliverance to travel from lived experience to a story being passed down. And that is exactly where things start to come apart. Because every single time, without exception, after 40 years, the new generation forgets. Not because they were worse than the generation before them, but because they had never experienced the deliverance themselves. They had only heard about it. And what you only hear about, no matter how powerful the story, never holds you the way something you lived through does. That's why the cycle keeps repeating. Not because God failed to give them enough time, but because 40 years of peace, even as a gift, can become a trap if you forget what produced it. The 40 years in the wilderness formed Israel because they depended on God every single day, manna every morning, a pillar of fire every night, nothing to lean on but Him. The 40 years of peace that followed could quietly erode exactly that. Because when everything is fine, it's easy to forget that things being fine didn't happen on its own. The number 40 in Judges is not the corridor of one individual. It is the breathing rhythm of an entire community, breathing in grace, breathing out forgetfulness, then crying out again. And God, time after time, still answers. Not because Israel deserved it, but because that is who He is. But of all the 40s we've walked through, none of them started from as low a place as the next one. A prophet, a tree, and a prayer he never expected God to answer the way He did. There's a detail in the story of Elijah that I think most people read past because it's too uncomfortable to sit with. Not the fire that fell from heaven on Mount Carmel, not the flight from Jezebel, but a single short sentence in 1 Kings 19:4. It is enough, Lord. Take my life. This is the prayer Elijah prayed immediately after the greatest victory of his ministry. He had just called fire down from heaven in front of all of Israel, had just proven before hundreds of the prophets of Baal that the Lord alone is God. And then, a letter from Queen Jezebel arrived, threatening to kill him by the next day. He ran into the wilderness, sat down under a tree, and asked to die. This was not a moment of weakness. This was total exhaustion, physical, emotional, spiritual, of a man who had given everything and had nothing left to continue with. And how did God respond? Not with a sermon, not with advice, not with a rebuke about how a prophet who just called down fire could possibly be this afraid. An angel came, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat." 1 Kings 19 coals, a jar of water, nothing else. Elijah ate and lay back down. The angel came a second time, no urgency, no explanation, and said only one more thing, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too great for you." 1 Kings 19:7. The journey is too great for you. Not an easier road is waiting ahead. Not everything is going to be fine. Just, the journey is too great and you need strength to make it. That is when the 40-day journey began. Elijah got up and walked, 40 days and 40 nights, to Horeb, the mountain of God. 1 Kings 19:8. What's worth noting is that he didn't begin that journey with solid faith or full recovery. He began it with the angel's food in his stomach. That was all he had, and God said that was enough. 40 days walking through the wilderness. No record of anything happening during that time. No miracles, no word from God, just walking, one day at a time. On the strength of a meal an angel had placed beside him while he was lying under a tree, wanting to die. When Elijah reached Horeb, he went into a cave, and God asked, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" 1 Kings 19:9. Not the question of someone who didn't know, but the question of someone who wanted him to say it out loud. Elijah answered with all of his pain. He was the only one left, and they were trying to kill him. And God didn't argue. He simply said, "Go out and stand on the mountain." Then a great wind came, tearing the mountains apart, shattering rocks, then an earthquake, then fire. But God was not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire. After all of that, a still small voice. 1 Kings 19:12. Elijah began his 40-day journey at the lowest point of his life. He ended it having learned what the fire from heaven could never teach him, that God is often not found in the greatest things you can see or feel. He is in the whisper you can only hear when you are still enough to listen. The 40 days in the wilderness didn't restore Elijah by giving him more strength. It restored him by bringing him to the right place and letting him hear what he needed to hear. Sometimes that is all 40 needs to do. Elijah arrived at Horeb exhausted and found the voice of God again. But the next story about the number 40 doesn't begin with exhaustion. It begins with water and a voice from heaven. Matthew 4:1 records something worth noting immediately after Jesus was baptized. Then the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness, not that he went on his own. not that anyone invited him. The Spirit led him in. The same verb that Deuteronomy 8:2 uses when describing God leading Israel into the wilderness for 40 years. That is not a coincidence. That is intentional. Because what happens during Jesus' 40 days is a direct parallel, clearly written. Nothing needs to be read into it, to everything Israel failed during their 40 years. Israel grew hungry in the wilderness and complained, demanding bread. They told Moses outright that they would rather have stayed in Egypt. Exodus 16:3. Jesus fasted for 40 days. And when Satan came and said, "Tell these stones to become bread," he quoted directly from the words Moses spoke to Israel after 40 years in the wilderness. Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Matthew 4:4. Deuteronomy 8:3. He didn't answer with theology. He answered with the exact lesson Israel had been taught and never learned. Israel tested God at Massah. Is the Lord among us or not? Exodus 17 proof. Demanded a sign. Demanded that he prove his presence. Satan came to Jesus a second time. Throw yourself down, for the angels will catch you. And he answered, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Matthew 4:7. Faith does not demand evidence before believing. Israel never understood that after 40 years. Jesus demonstrated it after 40 days. Israel danced around the golden calf, giving worship to a created thing instead of the Creator. Exodus 32. Satan took Jesus to a high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world, and said, all of this is yours if you bow down and worship me. Jesus answered, away from me, Satan. For it is written, worship the Lord your God. Matthew 4:10.
3 temptations.
3 times Jesus did exactly what Israel had failed to do. But here's what I don't want you to miss. Jesus did not enter the wilderness as someone beyond hunger, beyond exhaustion, beyond temptation. Luke 4:2 states it plainly. After 40 days he was hungry, genuinely hungry, his body genuinely worn down, and Satan chose precisely that moment to arrive. What held Jesus was not some supernatural strength that overrode the hunger. What held him was the identity he knew, even when his body was at its weakest point. Israel spent 40 years in the wilderness constantly asking, who are we? And constantly looking for the answer in things outside themselves. Bread, water, leaders, idols. Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness and never once asked that question, because he had already heard the answer before he stepped in. This is my beloved Son. Matthew 3:17. He entered the wilderness knowing who he was, and nothing, hunger, exhaustion, or Satan's promises could change that. Jesus didn't simply survive 40 days in the wilderness. He redid everything Israel had failed, in the same setting, under the same pressure, but on a foundation Israel never had, an identity confirmed before the testing ever began. And when the 40 days ended, his ministry began. But before we get to the final 40 in the Bible, there is a detail in the law of Moses that almost no one connects to everything we've just walked through. And when you see it, you'll understand why Paul mentions it with very specific numbers in a letter he wrote from prison. Of all the times the number 40 appears in the Bible, this is the one nobody talks about. Not a journey, not a season of waiting, not a period of being formed, but a number written into law. And it doesn't speak about what God does. It speaks about the boundary of what human beings are permitted to do to each other. Deuteronomy 25:3. 40 lashes may be given, but no more. In the context of the ancient Near East, this was extraordinary. The cultures surrounding Israel had no such limit. Physical punishment could continue for as long as the one passing judgment saw fit. But the law of Moses set a hard boundary, 40, no more, regardless of the severity of the crime. And Jewish rabbis, to make absolutely certain that no one accidentally crossed that line, administered only 39 lashes, one stroke held back as a safeguard. Because this law wasn't only protecting the one being punished, it was protecting the dignity of the one carrying out the sentence, keeping them from becoming more cruel than the law allowed. The number 40 here is not a corridor leading somewhere new. It is a wall. God built a wall out of the number 40 to limit what human beings could impose on one another. Then comes Paul. In 2 Corinthians 11:20 he writes, not as a complaint, but as a list of evidence of what he had endured for his faith. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 5 times. 39 lashes each time. Not an arbitrary number, that is precisely the limit the law of Moses allowed, minus the one stroke held back as a safeguard. 5 times that boundary of mercy was applied to Paul's body, and every time he got back up and kept going. When I read this passage in the context of every other appearance of 40, I had to stop for a long time. Because here, the number 40 doesn't appear as a period of time God uses to form someone. It appears as evidence that even within a legal system, even within punishment, God had encoded into it a limit of mercy. And Paul, the man who received 39 lashes 5 times over, understood that better than anyone. There is one small detail here that can't be overlooked. Jesus during his passion did not receive 39 lashes. He was flogged by Roman soldiers, bound by no Jewish law with no limit whatsoever. The boundary of mercy written into the law of Moses, that number 40, was not applied to him. And that was not a random injustice. That was what he chose to absorb in the place of those who should have been standing there. The number 40, whether it's a journey, a corridor, a gift, or a boundary, always has God standing behind it, sometimes as the one who leads, sometimes as the one who limits, and sometimes as the one who steps inside that boundary himself in place of us. And that brings us to the very last time. The only time in all of Scripture where the number 40 is not a test, not a punishment, not a corridor, but a meal on a beach. Remember the very first image of the number 40 in the Bible. Noah inside the ark, the door locked from the outside, darkness, unable to see anything, just waiting. That is how the number 40 begins. This is how it ends. After Jesus rose from the dead, Acts 1:3 records that he stayed with his disciples for 40 days before ascending to heaven. This is the last time this number appears in the Bible, and it looks nothing like any time before it. No test, no journey through the wilderness, nothing that needed to be proven or formed. Just one thing, presence. But look at how that presence showed up. John 20:19. The disciples were in a room they had locked from the inside out of fear. The same image as Noah, a closed door, darkness, not knowing what was waiting outside. But this time it wasn't God locking the door from the outside. They had locked themselves in because they were afraid. And Jesus walked through that door. No knocking, no calling out their names, no standing outside waiting for them to open it. He simply was there, standing among them. And the first thing he said was not a word of rebuke about the fact that they had run, had denied, had doubted. He said, "Peace be with you." John 20:19. Then the beach. John 21, the disciples had been out fishing all night and caught nothing. Early in the morning, a figure standing on the shore called out, asking if they had caught anything. They didn't recognize it was Jesus. He told them to cast their net on the right side of the boat, and the net filled with so many fish they couldn't haul it in. When they reached the shore, a fire of coals was already burning, fish already on it and bread beside it. John 21:9. He didn't wait for them to bring the fish up before he started cooking. He had everything ready before they even came ashore. No sermon, no training program, just fire, fish, bread, and Jesus saying, "Come and have breakfast." John 21:12. Then the road to Emmaus. Luke 24, 2 disciples walking, heavy with grief, talking through everything that had just happened. Jesus came and walked alongside them. But he didn't open by explaining or teaching. He asked, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" Luke 24:17. And then he listened. Let them say everything. The disappointment, the pain, the expectations that had shattered, before he said anything at all. And Thomas, the one who said plainly that he would not believe unless he could touch the wounds, Jesus didn't rebuke him for that doubt. He came, held out his hands, and said, "Put your finger here." John 20:27. The final 40 days in the Bible is made up of moments exactly like these. Not one of them has Jesus standing at a distance giving orders. He ate with them. He walked beside them. He let them touch him. The first 40 in the Bible, a man in the darkness, door locked, unable to see God anywhere. The last 40 in the Bible, God walking through a locked door and sitting down to eat with the people he loves. Same number. But everything had changed. So what is the number 40 actually saying? Not one single thing, and that is exactly the point. It speaks about Noah learning to trust the hands that shut the door. About Moses climbing the mountain a second time after everything had fallen apart. About an army standing still for 40 days and a boy stepping out on day 41, not because he was braver, but because he was trusting in something different. About generations given 40 years of peace and the hardest lesson of remembering. About a prophet under a tree, completely spent, and God arriving not with an explanation but with a meal, about a boundary of mercy written into law with that very number, and about the final 40 days, when the risen Christ didn't stand at a distance but walked through a locked door and sat down to eat with the people he loved. Same number, completely different stories. But one thing that never changed across all of them: God is always the one who orchestrates the 40, not people. Noah didn't choose 40 days of rain. Moses didn't schedule his time on the mountain. Elijah didn't plan his 40-day journey. Jesus was led into the wilderness by the Spirit. And the disciples didn't ask for 40 days with the risen Christ. They were given them. What does that mean for you? If you are in a season where the door has closed and nothing is opening, remember that Noah didn't force the door open ahead of time. If you are in a season where every direction feels sealed off, remember the image of Mem Sophet, the completely closed letter, and remember that it is still the same letter as the open Mem, the same God, the same presence. Whether you can see a way out or not, and if you are standing where Elijah stood, under a tree, worn out, not wanting to go on, then know that God didn't come to Elijah with a sermon. He came with bread and water, and he said just one thing: the journey is too great for you. Get up and eat. That is how 40 ends in the Bible. Not with a storm, not with judgment, but with a charcoal fire on a beach, and someone sitting down to eat with the people he loves, with the meal already prepared before they even reached the shore. Are you in an open mem season or a closed mem season right now? Leave one word in the comments, open or closed. I genuinely want to know. If this video opened something up for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.